growth forecast that the economic survey has put on the table. Joining us now to talk about the survey and, of course, ahead of the budget is Suman Bery, the Vice Chairman of the NITI Aayog. Mr. Bery, many thanks for joining us here on CNBC-TV18. Appreciate your time. The budget session is kick-started with the tabling of the economic survey. And so let's begin with that, Mr. Bery. The growth forecast, the growth projections being made by the survey, 6.5% real GDP growth, 11% nominal GDP growth. Many market economists that we've spoken with do seem to suggest that this is perhaps on the higher side than what they are estimating or forecasting, which is around 6%, if not slightly lower. What do you make of the growth estimates?
Shireen, the CEA has the apparatus for detailed short-term growth forecasts, and not only because I'm a senior member of the government, but also because that's not the space that NITI occupies. I would trust his judgment. But as an economist, what I would say is that the external environment does matter, and it matters particularly through two channels, which you understand fully well: the trade channel and the finance channel. And the finance channel itself has two parts. One, how much are global interest rates going to go up? And the second is, as it were, the capital flows into India. I think what my good friend Anand Nageshwaran has said, that in looking at the various growth drivers, and he's made this point explicitly, I believe, in his press conference, that even abstracting from slowing world trade growth, he believed that the growth rates that you mentioned are feasible. So my sense would be that the homework has been done. If you like, I can talk about the global economy a little bit, because that is relevant.
Absolutely. The global economy is relevant, and that is one of the risk factors that the survey has also highlighted. So let's pick up on that, Mr. Bery. As you point out, global interest rates will have a bearing on these growth estimates, and I think the survey also talks about entrenched inflation and hence a tighter monetary policy for longer. The implications of that, specifically as far as capital flows are concerned, and borrowing costs as well.
Yes. So I think, again, perhaps not in the survey, but certainly in the press conference that I did watch, the CEA talked about how it is in India's interests to have what one might call a Goldilocks economy. And what do I mean, and what does he mean, although it's my term, by a Goldilocks economy? It's an economy which does not stall, there's no recession, but it's not super hot. And the reason why we don't want it super hot is because, as he indicated, this has an impact on the on commodity prices, most importantly the price of oil. Now, as you know, the oil market is in a very strange configuration at the moment. What used to be a unified oil market is now a divided oil market, and as it were, what happens to the usual benchmark Brent, how that's reflected in the India basket has become much more complicated than it used to be. I think the important point is that for 23, it's not necessarily in India's interest for there to be a return to a very buoyant economy, because that might make the task of disinflation, particularly in the US, that much harder, which means a higher final or terminal Fed funds rate, which would put pressure on the RBI. So those are the mechanisms by which what happens globally has an impact on what happens in India.
Yes, the CA did talk about how he believes that a slower global economy is better for India, largely on account of lower commodity prices and, of course, the oil import bill, which has a significant bearing on us. But, Mr. Bery, let's talk about one of the big factors that has been a growth driver for us, and that has been government capex. And if I take a look at the centre's capex, it's increased, and according to the survey, it's increased from a long average of 1.7% of GDP in the 2009 to 2020 period to 2.5% of GDP. Now, the expectation is that the government capex should continue to be able to provide the fillip and accelerate growth further. But do you believe that this kind of capex, last year it was a 35%, 33 to 35% increase, this is feasible going forward?
That's an important question with a complicated answer. May I take a bit of time to respond?
Please do. Please do.
Yeah. Okay. So the first point is that India actually, by the standards of Latin America that I used to work on, but even though people talk about how much our gross fixed capital formation rate is down from the go-go years, it's still pretty healthy, I think, in the late 20s, 26, 27% of GDP. We would want it to be as much as 5 or 6 percentage points higher, but we are coming off a turbulent time, including COVID. So the first point I want to make is that the 2.7% is just union or union and states? Please remind me, Shirin. I think it's union and states.
That's the centre's capex. The centre's capex.
The important point, yeah? Centre, okay. Because states are not immaterial, and in fact, the state story is something I hope we'll get to. Okay, so it is certainly important for for employment and for the capital goods industry that at a time when, for various reasons, the private corporate sector is not in a bullish mood, that government does what it can. And as the economic survey points out, there have been improvements both in the hardware, highways, particularly waterways, railways, as it points out, were already doing pretty well, airports. So that's the dividend on the highway, on the government side. But I think what is very important, and what is very important as a response to your question about growth prospects, are the very important reforms that are pointed out in the economic survey in the software of capital expenditure by the public, of which the most important is this marvelous software invention of PM Gati Shakti. So and I can tell you now that I'm able, and NITI Aayog is part of this process, intensive monitoring plus software tools, all of this basically means 2 or 3 things. Talking about the public side, which is that not only is there less delay and waste, but what is very important, because these are sometimes projects that are financed through external borrowing, it means that faster delivery means lower costs because lower interest during construction. So the first point is that capital expenditure at the moment has been important, but we must keep it in perspective. It is only about, it's not even as much as a quarter of total capital expenditure, the rest of which is households and private corporates. And what we are expecting is that private corporate expenditure be mobilized, what's called crowding in by what government does. But the larger point I wanted to make, Shirin, links up with what has been a very lively and important discussion about fiscal consolidation. And I want to relate this to the major challenge that India, and indeed India for the world face, or the emerging world, which is our green transition. Because the fact of the matter is that our green transition is going to require higher investment rates or it's going to require investment. Whether those are higher investment rates really depends on the availability of financing, and the financing ideally should come from abroad. So what I'm saying is that there are 2 points of view one could have. One is that CapEx should slowly withdraw as the private sector revs up, which is the expectation and the hope because of the various forces that are pointed out in the economic survey. But in another context, if we can finance it, and that's itself a complicated issue, we should be wanting higher CapEx for quite a while. And so at NITI Aayog, thinking about the medium term, thinking about the green transition, which the whole world wants India to embark on, and which has strong push from the Honorable Prime Minister, this is going to require a sustained increase in public sector capex. I don't know what the Honorable Minister is going to announce tomorrow. What I do know is that in India's G20 year, there is a lot of attention being paid on, for example, raising multilateral financing for the green transition. We've already had our first launch of green bonds. So I wouldn't de-link the profile of our capex from the sources of financing. Thank you for being so indulgent and letting me use up your airtime on this rather technical discussion.
Not at all, Mr. Bery.
It's important.
But let me end. It is important, but let me end by asking you, since we are counting down to the budget, and what we heard from the Prime Minister this morning when he addressed the media outside Parliament was that this is a budget that the world is going to be watching very closely for hope and optimism. Now, in the context of India +1 or China +1, the survey also talks about how India has been able to position itself as a credible destination for diversification of capital. Do you believe that this could be the budget that further takes that agenda forward?
I think that the circumstances are propitious, but I think there is still a job to be done by people like myself, to, as it were, make the rest of the world aware of how much India has changed, and largely for the better, entirely for the better, I would say, and how much more welcoming it is. But let me add to that the point that Honorable Prime Minister has been making in the context of the G20. He has been very, very insistent, and rightly so, and effectively so, in making the G20 an all-of-India operation. So the attractiveness is not only union government policies, it is a manifestation of what he instructs me as his vice chairman to propagate: cooperative and competitive federalism. And I think that's happening. I think much as you hear about American states competing with each other, you are seeing that now between Indian states. So yes, India has to tell its story, but actually India's states have just as much at stake, and indeed are equally important partners in the investment stakes. And yes, all that we're talking about in the next 10 years is really about India returning to being able to sustain an investment boom. that is the optimism that we should be aspiring to.
Absolutely, and that is the hope and the optimism that the survey holds out, that India has the potential to grow at 7 to 8% over the rest of the decade. Of course, a lot of pieces need to fall into place to ensure that that happens. Suman Bery, always a pleasure. Appreciate you joining us here to take us through what you make of the economic survey, and more importantly, as a heads up to the union budget tomorrow. Thanks very much for your time. We will take a break, but coming up next, our team of reporters pore over the economic survey. We get you the fine print in just a minute.
देखो 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 नया टीवी देखो।